They sneered at her like she was dirt dragged in from the street. One called security the second she stepped through the door. Another laughed and told her to wait out back with the delivery guys. A manager walked past, gagged theatrically, and said her hair smelled like sweat and smoke. One whispered to a colleague, "Wrong floor, unless she's here to scrub it." And she said nothing, not because she didn't hear them, but because she had heard worse, and because she knew something none of them did. This wasn't a misunderstanding. This was a deliberate, routine humiliation dressed up as policy. And it was about to unravel a billion-dollar empire. You think stories like this don't happen anymore? Then stay. Watch what happens when a black woman, judged by the color of her skin and the silence of her posture, becomes the one holding every card they thought they dealt. Before the reveal, before the fallout, before the headlines, there was a moment. This one, where they laughed at the wrong woman. If you're ready for a story that hits where it hurts, subscribe now. Tell us where you're watching from. And drop a comment. Have you ever seen power get mistaken for something disposable? Because you're about to. The revolving doors of Callahan and Rowe's corporate headquarters spun open with a faint whoosh of pressurized glass as Laverne Ashford stepped into the lobby. Morning sunlight spilled through floor-to-ceiling windows, bouncing off polished marble and illuminating gold-lettered mission statements etched across the back wall. A massive floral arrangement in the center of the room stood like a monument to curated prestige. Pale orchids arranged in pristine symmetry above a sculpture no one ever really looked at. Laverne's heels tapped lightly against the floor, deliberate, steady. She walked with her shoulders square, her posture tall, her navy slacks crisp against her long frame. A tailored black coat hugged her form, ending just below the knee, the collar turned up slightly. Her natural curls, coiled tight and sculpted into a bun, framed the back of her neck like a crown. She carried a single leather folio under one arm. No phone, no handbag, no unnecessary accessories. She didn't need them. She was here to close a deal. And if all went according to plan, that deal would inject $2.3 billion into the future of the very company whose security sensors had just blinked her into the system. But that future didn't recognize her. Not yet. The reception desk loomed across the lobby, staffed by 3 uniformed associates. One typed half-heartedly at a keyboard while chewing gum with a kind of purposeful lethargy. The second, a younger woman with platinum extensions and a badge reading Sophie, leaned over the counter whispering something to the third, a man with slicked back hair and visible contempt behind his practiced smile. As Laverne approached, the whisper stopped. Sophie straightened and looked her up and down in one fluid, unfiltered sweep. Then came the question, casual, rehearsed, but razor-edged beneath its softness. Are you looking for the courier drop-off? Or maintenance access is around back? Laverne paused. She tilted her head slightly, not in confusion, but calculation. She'd heard this exact tone before, at investment conferences, boardroom lounges, once even at a Harvard alumni gala. It wasn't what they said. It was how they said it. Measured distance. Veiled threat. Coded doubt. Her eyes flicked briefly to the screen behind the counter. Digital signage rotated between internal announcements and a scrolling guest list. Her name was right there. L. Ashford Executive Meeting, 9:30 a.m. Conference, R4, 42nd floor. She raised a hand, not in protest, but in gesture, holding out the appointment confirmation. The document bore an embossed watermark, the kind not easily forged. Sophie didn't take it. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Just a moment. She turned to the man behind her and whispered again. Laverne stood silent, still. The room continued on around her. Men in monogrammed shirts, assistants with iPads, baristas walking past with lattes balanced on cardboard trays. The moment stretched. Then, as if summoned by collective discomfort, a manager appeared. He was tall, red-cheeked, early 40s, and carried the scent of over-applied cologne. His name tag read Trent. He strode over with a self-important clip to his steps, glanced briefly at Laverne, and then at the receptionist. Problem? Sophie offered him a half-smile. She says she has a meeting upstairs, but the appointment name doesn't match her look. Trent didn't blink. He turned fully toward Laverne and gave her the kind of half-nod one might offer to a late-arriving waitress. Then he sniffed, twice, sharp, like a man checking the air quality. "Sorry, ma'am," he said flatly, "but if you're going to linger here, we'll need you to step away from the main flow of traffic. We've had scent sensitivity complaints before. It might be best if you wait away from the desk." He gestured toward the corner near the utility closet, where a single folding chair sat beside a mop bucket. Laverne didn't move. Her heart beat once, slow and hard. She felt a rush of heat crawl up the back of her neck, but her expression didn't change. Trent kept talking. "And just a note, we do try to maintain a dress code standard in this area. Nothing personal. Some of our clientele expect a certain aesthetic. You understand." He said it all with that even tone, the kind that disguised malice as company policy, the kind that offered cruelty gift-wrapped in regulation. Laverne looked him in the eye. Her silence was deliberate, thick with history. Trent mistook it for confusion. Sophie folded her arms, now standing just behind him. The moment had become a performance, and Laverne had been cast, against her will, as the out-of-place disruptor. Laverne inhaled slowly through her nose, eyes scanning the back wall again. She spotted the corporate timeline etched in gold, building global integrity since 1973. She could recite their last 5 quarterly reports from memory. She had seen their leadership slides. She had negotiated directly with their chief legal officer and spoken twice by phone with their president of acquisitions. But here, now, she was just a mistake to be managed. She nodded once, as if to say, "I see you." Then she walked toward the chair in the corner and sat. She did not open her folder. She did not take out her phone. She simply folded her hands and stared at the elevator bank, 30 yards away and guarded like a shrine. Around her, the lobby of Callahan and Rowe pulsed with curated opulence. Velvet seating areas were arranged beneath chandeliers. Muted jazz filtered through recessed speakers, and an aroma of citrus and cedar diffused through vents in the ceiling. A man in a plaid blazer walked by balancing a croissant on a napkin like it was a stock portfolio. A young assistant pushed a rolling rack of garment bags toward the elevators. Laverne watched them without judgment. She had learned long ago to separate frustration from action, to hold offense not in her throat but in her memory, where it could be shaped later into consequence. But that detachment was tested just 6 minutes later, when a woman in a pale blue custodial uniform approached with a frown stitched deep between her brows. Without introducing herself, the woman waved a gloved hand at Laverne as if shooing off a loiterer. "Sorry, that chair's not for guests. It's where we leave deliveries and clean up carts during lunch reset. You'll have to wait somewhere else." Laverne looked at her, measuring whether it was worth correcting the assumption. She didn't stand immediately, so the woman gestured again, firmer this time, repeating that this wasn't the public waiting area. Laverne quietly rose and gave a nod, not of agreement, but acknowledgement. She walked back toward the front desk, crossing once again the invisible threshold where dignity was filtered through gatekeeping. Kendra, the blonde receptionist, saw her coming and turned her face away. Sophie leaned down behind the counter, pretending to arrange brochures. Only Mallory, the youngest of the 3, looked up. Her eyes darted to Laverne's folder, then quickly back to her screen. Laverne stood in place. The hallway was beginning to fill with other guests now, mostly white, mostly male, mostly dressed in the exact uniform of mid-level executive ambition. Navy suits, brown Oxfords, logo cufflinks. A pair of interns in slim-cut trousers brushed past her without a glance. One of them muttered something under his breath that Laverne didn't catch, but the other laughed. A few feet away, near the espresso counter, 2 men sipped cappuccinos and stared openly at her. One said something too loudly about community outreach programs renting space again. The other, grinning, asked whether the food stamps office had moved into the tower. Laverne kept her posture locked. She shifted the folder into both hands now, tightening her grip as the weight of accumulated slights pressed inward like a vice. Finally, she cleared her throat, not loudly, just enough for presence. "Excuse me," she said, holding the printed confirmation forward. "I'm here for the 9:30 executive meeting. Conference R4. My name is Laverne Ashford. It's on the docket. Trent reemerged from a hallway near the main elevators, now sipping a paper cup of coffee. He saw her outstretched arm and sighed audibly before approaching again. He took the paper without eye contact and flicked through it like it was a menu he hadn't ordered from. His fingers tapped the paper dismissively, then folded it in half and returned it without a word. You might be in the wrong building, he said, with a tone so flat it nearly echoed. The Community Equity Coalition meets down on State Street. This isn't the right place for walk-ins. Laverne stared at him, not blinking. It's the right place, she said simply. The names are on your schedule. He didn't bother looking. The tension between them now hung thick, coiled like the pause before a dropped match. Mallory shifted in her seat, clearly uneasy. But she said nothing. Trent leaned back and forced a small laugh. Tell you what, he said. Why don't you go wait at the side bench, and I'll buzz someone from facilities to check with scheduling. This wasn't a delay tactic. It was erasure. An attempt to make her disappear, to be contained, categorized, then quietly removed. A form of violence, far older than any fist. Laverne nodded once again, her silence a shield, her resolve hardening. She walked to the side bench, which wasn't technically meant for guests either, but no one stopped her this time. As she sat, a young man in line at the front desk said to no one in particular, "You'd think they'd at least have a staff entrance." A woman beside him laughed through her nose. Maybe she's here for the charity wing. They get people like that sometimes. Her? Looks like she came straight off a courthouse bench. Laverne didn't move. She didn't speak. But something inside her shifted. A weight rebalanced, a fuse lowered into place. She stared straight ahead now, not at anyone, but at the company's crest above the elevator doors. A lion wrapped in laurels, teeth bared in honor, claws lifted in victory. A symbol of dominance disguised as excellence. A few minutes passed. Then a new receptionist came to the desk, an older gentleman with a quiet presence, salt and pepper beard, and eyes that carried distance. He logged into the terminal, checked the schedule, and froze. He leaned down toward Sophie and whispered something urgent. She stood up straighter. Her lips parted. She looked across the room, toward the woman still seated in the shadows of corporate pride. Her face changed slightly, something between dread and disbelief. Mallory looked up too, her cheeks flushed pale. No one from upstairs had descended to ask why the primary stakeholder in a multi-billion-dollar acquisition was sitting beside a mop closet in an Armani coat. The lobby had grown louder, the hum of conversation rising and falling as more employees began flooding the space with morning rituals, coffee runs, badge swipes, greetings that were more habit than sincerity. The front desk had resumed its regular rhythm. Trent was now gone, perhaps bored of the game or unaware that it was ending soon. In his place stood a younger man with wire-rimmed glasses who barely glanced in Laverne's direction. And then, without warning, the latest escalation emerged, loud and confident in its ignorance. A tall man in a charcoal vest and rolled-up shirt sleeves rounded the hallway near the conference suites, glanced in Laverne's direction, and paused mid-step. He looked at her, then scanned the area as though seeking confirmation from some invisible authority. His brow furrowed, and his voice, loud and intrusive, cut through the conversations nearby. "Hey, who let her in here?" His tone was neither curious nor polite. It was accusatory, like discovering someone had parked in a CEO's reserved spot. "She's not wearing company ID. She's not in client protocol colors. Does she even work here?" The silence that followed wasn't of concern, but anticipation. Nearby, a cluster of interns in tailored casuals turned their heads and snorted. One, sipping iced espresso through a metal straw, whispered, "You think she's a client? No chance. Look at her shoes, wrong decade." Another, laughing too loudly, added, "Maybe she's somebody's nanny who wandered upstairs." Laverne kept still. Her face didn't flinch, but the warmth that had once held her breath steady began to cool into something firmer. She didn't look at them. She didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her silence was not submission, it was measurement. One of the interns noticed her expression, faltered, then quickly looked away. But the moment wasn't over. The tall man, now emboldened by the ripple of laughter behind him, muttered to himself as he walked away, loud enough for those in earshot. Security's slipping. You let one wrong person into the client floor, and the whole tower's compromised. Before the words even had time to settle, the unmistakable figure of Meredith Doyle appeared from the elevator foyer. Chief of Human Resources. Tall, angular, and immaculately dressed in a beige skirt suit with a silk scarf knotted so tightly it seemed stitched into her posture, Meredith walked like she was judging every surface she passed. Her heels were quiet but absolute, and her perfume left a crisp trail behind her, notes of citrus, authority, and clinical detachment. Her eyes locked onto Laverne within seconds. She didn't ask who she was. She didn't check a roster. She approached not with caution, but with a kind of performative urgency, like she was cleaning up a public spill. When Meredith stopped a few feet from Laverne, she produced a lavender-scented handkerchief from her purse and held it delicately to her nose, as if the very air around Laverne had become contaminated. Her gaze swept over Laverne's frame, slow, methodical, invasive. Her eyes didn't conceal their disgust. Still silent, she turned to the younger man at reception and issued a quiet command, motioning discreetly toward the back corridor. The man nodded, pale-faced, and disappeared through a side door marked Staff Access Only. Within seconds, a soft click echoed from a panel behind Laverne. The hallway to the service elevators had been unlocked. Meredith gestured toward it without words, the handkerchief still pressed to her nose. Laverne understood the implication instantly. She wasn't being asked to wait elsewhere. She was being removed. Silently, quietly, like a misfiled document. The logic was simple and cruel. If you couldn't erase her presence, you could at least hide her in the architecture. For the second time that hour, Laverne stood, not out of compliance, but calculation. As she rose, the interns turned again, one of them now openly filming the moment with a phone under the guise of checking messages. Their laughter wasn't malicious so much as amused. Young people who had never seen consequences walk through the front door in heels. Meredith stepped back a fraction as Laverne walked past her, keeping the handkerchief in place as if proximity alone might stain her suit. Without a word, without a look, Laverne entered the dim hallway leading toward the back stairwell. The floor changed beneath her shoes, from marble to tile, from tile to industrial vinyl. The air grew colder. The space narrowed. The lighting buzzed faintly overhead. This was where broken ceiling tiles were replaced, where carts of filtered water were stored beside rusted ladders and half-drained mop buckets. This was the path used by food service, maintenance, overnight cleaning crews. It was also, for that moment, the only path given to a woman about to sign away or deliver the future of the very company that had just consigned her to its back halls. She reached the base of the staff elevator, but didn't press the call button. Instead, she placed her folder atop a battered cabinet beside the emergency fire extinguisher and leaned back against the wall. She looked up at the ceiling, exhaled, and let the weight of 3 decades of navigating coated ceilings rest quietly against her ribs. She wasn't surprised. Disgusted, yes. Worn, perhaps, but not surprised. She had prepared for this, maybe not for the specific faces or insults, but for the shape of it, the mechanism, the routine by which people like her were tested in silence before being recognized in headlines. Back upstairs, Meredith returned to the desk and made a small joke to Sophie, something about maintaining image. Mallory, clearly shaken, whispered, "Are you sure we shouldn't call upstairs?" Meredith gave a dismissive shake of the head. Yet her spine remained straight, and her gaze steady, her eyes reflecting the sterile steel walls around her, as though she had long known how to absorb environments that tried to reject her. When the doors opened on the mezzanine level, a transitional floor used for vendor setup and special events, she was met not by an executive assistant or security officer, but by a young woman in a navy blue sheath dress with an iPad clutched to her side. The woman looked startled to see Laverne emerge from the staff elevator, her brows lifting in confusion that quickly hardened into skepticism. There was a moment of hesitation, then a cautious smile that was more habit than warmth. "You're early," she said in a high, professional tone. Please wait here, and I'll check your paperwork." Before Laverne could speak, the woman turned and strode briskly toward a folding table lined with catering schedules and floral samples. Laverne followed slowly, each step heavy with restraint. The room was arranged like a preparation zone for corporate hospitality. Linen carts, open boxes of promotional merchandise, a portable espresso bar still half assembled. This was not the conference floor, not the boardroom tier, not the world she was meant to walk into. It was the world they thought she belonged to. And that belief was about to harden into action. Meredith Doyle entered moments later, heels clicking across the tile, still immaculate in her beige suit, handkerchief tucked discreetly back into her bag. She looked around, spotted Laverne standing alone, and approached with the same artificial concern reserved for misunderstood volunteers. Behind her trailed another assistant, a younger man in a slate vest who carried a clipboard and moved with theatrical urgency. Meredith clapped her hands once, softly, and turned to the assistant. "Make sure we get a uniform packet and a provisional resume form." She then looked at Laverne, her expression one of condescending reassurance. "We're a little disorganized this morning," she said sweetly. "You'll be part of the event staff team, correct?" Laverne said nothing, and Meredith misread the silence as confusion. "Don't worry, we'll walk you through the whole process." She nodded toward a nearby storage door. "There's a cart in there with trays, glassware, and serving gloves. You'll be working the east side mezzanine for the ribbon-cutting brunch." When the assistant returned with a thin folder, Meredith took it and held it out toward Laverne, as though offering charity. Inside were basic intake forms, contact details, emergency information, previous employment history. And, at the top, temporary event support, Tier C. Meredith kept speaking, her voice now brisk and efficient. "The team leads will be coming down from facilities shortly to train everyone on protocol. We expect tight posture, discreet service, and no talking with guests unless addressed directly. Please keep personal belongings out of sight. If you don't have black flats or closed-toe shoes, let us know now." Laverne blinked once, but did not take the folder. She did not move. Her hands remained fixed on the leather case in front of her. A flicker of uncertainty passed through Meredith's expression, but it faded quickly. She turned away and began reviewing notes on her phone. Just then, the elevator on the far side of the room opened again. A tall man with silver hair and a long wool coat stepped out, pulling a sleek suitcase behind him. His bearing suggested importance, an executive, perhaps a guest speaker, someone used to being greeted, not directed. Meredith turned to greet him with a polished smile, walking briskly toward the entrance. "Good morning," she said, her voice now smooth and practiced. "We're honored to have you join us today." Without looking back, she waved toward Laverne. "Could you give this gentleman a hand with his luggage? He's one of our legacy partners." Laverne didn't respond. She didn't flinch. The request hung in the air like a dare. Meredith, mistaking the silence for compliance, added with a half-laugh, "You seem like someone who's done this before. Maybe hotel work? Catering? You have that presence." The man paused, glancing between them. Laverne turned her head slowly toward Meredith. For a moment, no one moved. The assistant with the clipboard shifted uncomfortably. The young woman with the iPad looked away. Even the executive guest seemed uncertain, as if sensing something unspoken pressing against the clean, rehearsed choreography of the morning. But Meredith, too self-assured to register dissonance, continued giving directions as if Laverne were invisible again. She spoke not to her, but around her, assigning trays and linens and emergency contact badges. It was the kind of moment designed to erase dignity by casual misuse, not with open insults, but with assumptions so deep they didn't feel like cruelty to the one speaking them. Laverne, for her part, absorbed every second of it without breaking composure. She inhaled once, shallow and silent, then turned back toward the wall of windows on the far side of the room. Outside, the skyline of the city gleamed behind a curtain of mist, towering above them like silent witnesses. She thought briefly of her father, how he taught her to never respond when others reached to define her. "Let them show themselves," he used to say. "Let them write their own stories with the tools they tried to use against you." It's easier to dismantle what's exposed. Back inside, Meredith returned to the table, now slightly irritated that Laverne had not retrieved the resume packet or touched the rolling cart. She gestured again. "If you don't move quickly, you'll miss prep briefings. We don't want anyone falling behind." Laverne finally shifted. She adjusted the folder beneath her arm, turned slowly to face the group, and let her eyes scan each of them in turn, not with confrontation, but with silent memorization. Then, without a word, she walked to the far end of the room, where the hallway to the elevators reappeared like a door forgotten by design. She pressed the button. No one tried to stop her. No one asked where she was going, because to them, she was still a body to be relocated, not a presence to be understood. But when the doors closed behind her and she began rising once more, she had stood in places more ruthless than this, negotiated under greater scrutiny, survived rooms far colder. The silence here was not intimidating. It was just expected. Her heels touched down on the pale oak flooring with a grace that suggested possession rather than trespass. Her folder, still tucked under her arm, bore the name of a transaction that could alter the fate of the company, whose logo now glowed from every glass door. She passed two assistants who didn't look up from their tablets, their focus trained on inboxes and schedules, eyes flicking only briefly toward her before returning to what they deemed important. She moved with purpose, heading toward the executive conference suite at the far end of the corridor, past etched steel doors bearing initials she had memorized during contract due diligence. When she reached the central reception alcove outside the meeting room, Meredith Doyle stood once more, perfectly positioned like a sentinel of bureaucracy, her posture impeccable, her eyes sharp and unwavering. It took her only a second to realize Laverne had made it here. Her eyes narrowed, not in shock, but disapproval, as if presence alone was an intrusion. Laverne paused just shy of the conference entrance and spoke calmly, her voice measured but firm. "I'd like to speak with the director overseeing today's executive presentation. My name is Laverne Ashford. My meeting is scheduled for 9:30. It was the first time she had introduced herself fully in that building, and it was deliberate. Meredith, however, responded with the brittle patience reserved for people she deemed beneath correction. She stepped forward slightly, adjusting her scarf, and delivered a smile so tight it could cut glass. "I'm sorry, but I think there's been a misunderstanding. The executive team does not engage with unsolicited service vendors, especially not individuals who arrive through staff access without prior clearance." Laverne didn't respond. She simply held up the confirmation document again, now folded from handling, but still embossed, still undeniable. Meredith didn't reach for it. Instead, she tilted her head and let her gaze drift slowly over Laverne's face. There was no veil now, her voice lowered to a whisper edged with venom. "You know, it's unprofessional to come to a corporate floor without basic preparation. I'm trying to say this respectfully, but you should have considered some concealer. A woman representing serious money shouldn't look like she just rolled out of a Greyhound terminal." Laverne stood absolutely still. Not even her eyes shifted. Meredith took that stillness as proof of shame. She turned to the receptionist desk beside her and gestured dismissively. "Mark, please escort this individual back to guest check-in. This isn't the appropriate level for consultations." Behind them, the frosted glass doors to conference suite B buzzed faintly, a signal that someone inside was checking the security panel. Laverne remained silent, still holding the folder, but her breathing had slowed to something deeper, quieter, colder. She turned slightly to the left as a man in an IT badge passed by, earbuds in, hoodie slouched over one shoulder. He slowed briefly when he caught sight of her and smirked. The words came as a careless mutter, but loud enough to leave their stain. "She looks like the villain from one of those 90s cop shows. You know, the ones who run numbers in back alleys and get caught at the end." His laugh was a single breath of derision before he disappeared down the hallway. The receptionist, an older man named Mark, stood awkwardly behind his desk, clearly uncertain of how to proceed. His eyes darted between Laverne and Meredith, between duty and discomfort. But Meredith gave him no choice. Her nod was final. "Escort her." Let's not make a scene." She turned back toward the glass doors, tapping her ID badge against the reader with the same confidence she had shown when assigning uniforms downstairs. The lock clicked. The door slid halfway open. Inside, a panel of suits could be seen arranging documents, checking tablets, sipping from espresso cups. Their laughter echoed faintly. A merger decision was minutes away. Billions were on the table, and none of them knew the woman outside was the lever on which it all turned. Laverne did not move toward the exit. Instead, she looked at the small, steel-plated plaque mounted beside the conference door. "Welcome, Ashford Equity Consortium Private Briefing." The name was unmistakable. It was her name. It was her fund. It was her meeting. She looked back at Meredith, who had turned fully now, not realizing what was about to unfold. Laverne held her gaze for several seconds longer than necessary. Then, finally, she moved, but not backward. She stepped toward the door. Mark flinched. Meredith began to speak, her voice suddenly more shrill. "Wait, what are you doing?" But Laverne said nothing. She lifted her hand, pressed her palm to the sensor, and the biometric scanner glowed green. Access granted. The door opened completely. Meredith stared, her mouth half open. Behind her, silence fell inside the room. The executives had turned. They saw the figure entering, poised and quiet, and carrying a folder that had survived indignity, mockery, and exile. They rose to their feet slowly. The man in the center, senior partner, CFO, stepped forward, extended his hand, and smiled with the unmistakable recognition of someone greeting power. The floor was covered in soft, woven wool, soundless under designer shoes and patent heels. A digital screen blinked awake behind her, showing the agenda for the closed-session strategy meeting. At the top, Ashford Equity Consortium Strategic Acquisition Terms Finalization. Everything was in place. Everything except the respect that should have arrived with her. Moments before the door had opened, they had called her a service vendor, a criminal, a stranger. Now they greeted her with hollow courtesy, like an awkward formality after an insult too loud to take back. Some rose to shake her hand. Others nodded stiffly, eyes shifting sideways, embarrassed not by what they had assumed, but by how wrong they had been. The man seated to her right, a regional director who had joined the firm 2 years earlier, fumbled with his notes and offered a tremulous apology wrapped in flattery. Another, more composed, handed her a stylized folder with embossed gold lettering, as if the sudden presence of wealth in her hands would undo what had just occurred. But she knew better. She had known for years. She had seen the way silence became a weapon, how microaggressions masked themselves as protocol. And she could still feel Meredith Doyle's last words echoing beneath her ribs like smoke caught in cloth. Still, she said nothing. Instead, she reviewed the opening slide on the projection, nodded once, and stepped aside as the meeting facilitator began introductions. For 20 minutes, the room functioned like a machine, orderly, professional, but humming with discomfort. Everyone spoke with extra clarity, as though compensating for an invisible weight. Laverne listened without interruption, occasionally annotating sections in her leather folio. When her turn arrived to present, she stood without hesitation and began a seamless breakdown of the proposed deal structure, risk protection clauses, and forward-facing growth objectives. Her voice was precise, cool, and unwavering. No bitterness, no vengeance, just excellence delivered with surgical control. But behind the glass, in the hall beyond, the machine was preparing another insult. During a recess between presentations, the chief of facilities approached Laverne quietly and requested to speak with her. His tone was polite, his words wrapped in supposed concern, but the core of his message was clear. Due to internal scheduling conflicts and new media sensitivity, they would need her to step away from the glass conference room during the second phase of deliberation. It was suggested, not requested, that she wait in a private holding space to reduce distractions. His voice carried that careful phrasing that whitewashes rejection as logistical necessity. Laverne didn't flinch. She only asked where this private space would be. He hesitated, then led her toward the rear corridor. She followed in silence. past the main elevator bank, down a short hall lined with storage closets and emergency supply cabinets. He opened a door, without signage, and motioned inside. The room was barely lit, its only furnishings a folding table, a few plastic chairs, and a cart stacked with surplus, promotional mugs. A stack of unused carpeting leaned against one wall, and the air smelled faintly of stale linen and industrial cleaner. The windowless space was called private, but it felt more like isolation, like exile. She entered calmly, sat down at the table, and opened her folder once again. Before he left, the facilities officer added one final note. He mentioned that someone would be stationed nearby for protocol integrity, and in turn, just to monitor access and ensure confidential documents remain secure. The implication was insulting. She was not to be trusted in the room alone. She was being watched. Minutes later, the intern arrived, barely 23, nervous, trying to mask discomfort with professionalism. He sat on a stool beside the door like a security checkpoint made flesh. He didn't speak. He just glanced at his tablet occasionally, then back at Laverne, as if making sure she hadn't taken anything. She ignored him. She wasn't there for him. But the walls in that room seemed to contract around her with every passing second, each crack in the tile whispering, "You don't belong." Time crawled. Then came the coffee. A young assistant from hospitality entered unannounced, carrying a tray with 2 paper cups and an awkward smile. She placed one in front of Laverne and said, "Here you go, thought you might need some energy." Then, smirking faintly, she leaned closer and asked if she wanted any extra brown sugar. Her tone laced with amusement, the emphasis on brown unmistakable. Laverne looked at her in complete stillness. No expression, no reaction. She simply said, "No thank you," then took the cup, lifted it with steady hands, and returned to her notes. The assistant didn't linger. She turned and exited, her footsteps brisk with the false confidence of someone who had just delivered a joke they thought clever. The intern at the door looked down at his screen again, pretending not to have heard. The silence thickened once more. Laverne sipped the coffee slowly, bitter, burnt, fitting. Her hands turned another page in the folder. She annotated a clause in red ink and adjusted a numerical estimate. The financials in her hand would determine if the entire firm saw another fiscal year in black ink or fell into a deficit spiral. Yet they had placed her here, in a forgotten room, under surveillance, after stripping her dignity, then offering sarcasm disguised as caffeine. And even now, they did not realize what was coming. As she neared the executive suite once more, the doors ahead opened with a pneumatic sigh. Meredith Doyle stood on the other side, still holding a clipboard, still wrapped in the armor of her beige professionalism. The moment their eyes met, the color drained slightly from Meredith's face. She tried to summon the authority she had worn so easily earlier, but something in her faltered. She began to speak, perhaps to intercept, perhaps to redirect, but the words stuck in her throat as Laverne walked past her without pause. Not a glance, not a word, just a presence too solid to be denied. The conference room had filled with partners now. Executives, shareholders, counsel, and stakeholders from both sides of the impending deal sat in high-back chairs or hovered near carafes of still water. Their voices hummed with anticipation, but the hum stuttered as Laverne entered. Conversation stalled. Heads turned. One by one, expressions shifted from confusion to realization to stunned recognition. She walked the full length of the table, slow and unbothered, her steps unbroken by the weight of expectation or the memory of what they had done. At the head of the room, beside a frosted glass wall bearing the Ashford Equity seal, a chair had been left empty. She reached it, placed her folder on the table, and opened it with clinical precision. Inside was a printed executive dossier bearing the seal of her fund, the summary terms of the acquisition, and her own name, Laverne A. Ashford, President and Chief Executive Officer, Ashford Equity Holdings. She placed the document flat in the center of the table, adjusted it slightly, and turned her gaze to the room. They saw her now, not as the woman from the lobby, not as the figure mistaken for service staff, but as the sole decision-maker behind the largest capital movement, their firm, had seen in over a decade. The CFO sat frozen with his pen half raised. A junior partner dropped a paperclip, its tiny clatter loud in the sudden quiet. One of the external counsel leaned back slowly, exhaling as if his lungs had been holding denial. Meredith stood just outside the doorway, the clipboard slack in her hand, her expression no longer composed, no longer superior, just hollow. Laverne didn't look at her. She addressed the room directly, her voice calm, neither cold nor warm, just sharp enough to cut through the silence. "Good morning. I've been reviewing the cultural readiness of this firm. I was promised transparency, respect, and professionalism as part of the due diligence process." She let that hang. Her eyes scanned faces one by one. None could hold her gaze for long. She continued, "Before we move forward with finalization, I'd like to know who oversees corporate culture, hiring practices, and client engagement protocols." No one responded at first. Then, slowly, a compliance officer near the end of the table cleared his throat and muttered something about shared responsibilities across departments. Laverne nodded once, then opened her folder again and removed a list. Printed in clean, efficient font, it named each person who had interacted with her that morning: front desk, security, event staff, Meredith Doyle. She slid the list across the table. "I will require formal written explanations from each of these individuals. Until then, the deal remains under review." She didn't raise her voice. She didn't threaten. But the message struck deeper than any outburst could have. Because they all understood now, what they had done wasn't just offensive. It was reckless. Laverne stepped back from the table. "I'd also like to note," she said without inflection, "that today's conduct has introduced significant reputational risk to this partnership." Several in the room shifted, one muttering that they'd get ahead of it, that they'd prepare statements, that it was all a misunderstanding. But no one said it didn't happen. No one denied the truth, because the truth was now written in every breathless pause, in every eye that refused to meet hers. She stood quietly as the room recalibrated itself around her. The very fabric of authority, once woven around whiteness and assumption, had been ripped open by the presence of one woman who had walked through every layer of disrespect with her dignity intact. A board member at the far end finally broke the silence. "Is it really you, Laverne Ashford?" The voice held disbelief, not out of doubt, but guilt. She looked at him, eyes calm, and replied simply, "Yes. You've been speaking to my firm for the last 3 months." The tone in the room changed. Not with comfort, but with urgency. Suddenly, everyone had questions. Everyone wanted clarity. But Laverne didn't entertain their pivot. She had offered them their moment. She had exposed their culture with their own actions. The weight was now theirs to carry. She closed her folder and walked to the wall of windows overlooking the city. The glass reflected her back to them, silhouetted against towers built on the myth that power looks a certain way, speaks a certain way, arrives through certain doors. She had come through the back, been hidden behind mop closets and forgotten rooms, laughed at, policed, ignored. And now she stood above them all, not in defiance, but in proof. The executives now leaned forward, voices softer, questions less pointed, their confidence visibly checked by the weight of what had transpired. Laverne remained composed, never theatrical, never vindictive. She adjusted her notes, crossed a section with her pen, and handed a revised outline to the CFO for final review. It was clear to everyone present that she was not just there to approve or reject a deal. She was there to set a new tone for accountability. 10 minutes into that recalibrated discussion, the door opened again. A senior aide stepped in quietly and walked directly to Laverne, whispering something discreetly in her ear. Laverne nodded once, then turned to the room and spoke with deliberate calm. "There's a secondary session required. I've called in key personnel for clarification regarding internal conduct. I expect your full attention." None of the board members objected. Some looked relieved. Some looked pale. All nodded. Moments later, the door opened again and Meredith Doyle reappeared, this time accompanied by Karen Whitmore, the head of front office operations, whose behavior had been instrumental in the humiliation Laverne suffered in the lobby. Karen entered with her chin lifted, but eyes unsettled. She recognized several faces around the table, most of whom looked away. She spotted Laverne seated at the head, surrounded by executives she once emailed directives to, and confusion overtook her usual confidence. The aide pointed her to a chair across from Laverne. She hesitated but complied. Meredith remained standing behind her, stiff, almost trembling. Laverne didn't look up immediately. Instead, she tapped her tablet and the room's central screen flickered to life. The lights dimmed slightly. The display began to roll security footage, discreet, time-stamped, silent. A shot of the main entrance. Laverne walking in. The moment she was intercepted by Karen. The way she was blocked from approaching the desk. The wave of Karen's hand. The dismissive tone, clear from her body language. The smirk. Then the manager stepping in, the exaggerated sniffing, the gesture toward the service hallway. The laughter of nearby interns. The slow, visible shrinking of Laverne's space. The footage shifted angles, switching to the mezzanine floor. Meredith's arrival. Her posture as she pulled out a handkerchief. The way she gestured without speaking, as if moving a nuisance. The moment she ordered event documents prepared. The clip of her asking Laverne to carry someone's bag. The audio wasn't needed. The images spoke louder than any transcript. By the time the presentation ended, no one was taking notes. Everyone sat in stillness, absorbing the mirror that had been held up to them. Karen, now visibly shaken, opened her mouth to explain, but Laverne raised a hand, not abruptly, just enough to silence the moment before it turned into excuse. She addressed the room, not Karen. This is not about individual discomfort. It's about systemic tolerance. These actions didn't occur in isolation. They reflect a pattern of behavior validated by silence and protected by power. She turned slightly. Until we unlearn the reflex to judge credibility based on aesthetics, accent, or origin, we are not ready to lead in any real sense. She looked back at Karen. And if those in charge of first impressions are this disconnected from the core of our values, then we must reconsider who is allowed to speak for us. Karen's face was drained of color. Her hands sat tightly folded in her lap. Meredith remained frozen behind her, unsure whether to speak or vanish. No one defended them, not even those who had once echoed their tone in other rooms. Not one board member spoke in their favor, because now speaking would implicate. The silence became the verdict. Laverne then laid a folder on the table in front of her. Inside was a compiled summary of previous incidents involving client complaints, uninvestigated HR filings, and ignored patterns, all pointing to the cultural rut that had been permitted to grow in the name of convenience. She didn't read them aloud. She didn't need to. Instead, she said clearly, "There will be restructuring. I'll be working directly with the oversight team to ensure every level of interaction aligns with the vision this company claims to uphold. Those who cannot reflect that vision will be replaced. No threats, no fury, just certainty." A final line of protocol spoken by someone who had earned her authority tenfold. Karen looked down now, the weight of humiliation finally greater than her defense mechanisms. Meredith swallowed hard, then reached for the back of a chair, as if bracing herself for the inevitable. The room remained hushed, as if everyone were afraid to breathe too loudly in the presence of consequence. Laverne stood. That simple act triggered movement. Several people stood with her instinctively, as if their bodies remembered the hierarchy better than their minds. She gathered her materials, nodded once to the room, and walked to the exit. No flourish, no backward glance, just presence. Behind her, the board remained seated in stunned silence. No one asked to speak. The footage on the screen lingered for one more frame, Karen's face frozen in mid-smirk, before the display faded to black. That control now rested firmly in the hands of the woman they had once misjudged. Her absence spoke louder than her presence ever had. No follow-up memo, no dramatic outburst, just a vacuum of respect and a countdown no one could stop. News traveled fast within the firm, moving like an uncontained spark. Employees who had been present only at the periphery of the morning's humiliations began hearing murmurs. A woman they had dismissed was in fact the architect of their future. The name Ashford began appearing in internal alerts, in flagged PR notices, in compliance emails. And by early afternoon, the Board of Governance convened a formal emergency session to address what had now escalated beyond a reputational risk. It had become a moral reckoning. Inside a sealed conference call, chaired remotely by the legal division's risk mitigation lead, every executive on the prior guest list was summoned to testify to the series of events that had led to the breakdown in corporate decorum. Those who had laughed stayed silent. Those who had watched and said nothing now fumbled for words. Meredith Doyle was removed from the call mid-session, her badge access revoked by the time she returned to her desk. Karen Whitmore was notified that her employment was terminated effective immediately due to violations of internal conduct codes and reputational compromise. Her office was cleared under supervision, her company devices seized, her name stripped from every management portal. Trent, the lobby manager, was dismissed without severance. His leadership file was annotated with a performance alert citing inability to distinguish clients from bias-formed assumptions. Even the facilities lead who had directed Laverne into the storage room received disciplinary action and an immediate demotion, reassigned to internal logistics, pending retraining. These decisions were not driven by emotion but by necessity. A corporation that had once thrived on precision could no longer afford the optics of structural neglect. By evening, the company's public relations team was forced to release a carefully worded statement acknowledging the incident and confirming the departure of key personnel. But the statement did little to slow the storm. The story had already escaped into the world, carried by whispers, leaks, and a single line from an internal staffer that quickly became the headline across every major business outlet. A billion-dollar deal unraveled in minutes because someone judged her by the color of her skin. Social media picked it up within the hour. LinkedIn threads exploded with debates over corporate culture, racial bias, and silent complicity in professional spaces. Former employees of the firm added their voices, some revealing older stories of ignored discrimination, others confessing that what happened to Laverne had once happened to them, just not in front of the right cameras or investors. News anchors framed it as the cautionary tale of the decade. Financial analysts ran segments titled "When Bias Breaks Business," dissecting the company's sudden stock drop. In less than 24 hours, the firm lost over 9% of its market value. Investors demanded explanation. Board members were inundated with calls. Competitors quietly capitalized on the instability, whispering offers to clients now unsure about placing their trust in a brand whose integrity had been publicly dismantled. But more devastating than the market crash was the internal reckoning. Every level of the company now found itself questioning not just who had failed, but who had watched them fail in silence. Diversity trainings were no longer theoretical. Internal audits were not abstract. They were immediate, mandatory, and brutally honest. HR departments began sifting through years of ignored complaints, reopening files with timestamps that now reeked of liability. But perhaps the most profound impact was psychological. The culture of comfort, of inherited assumption, of unchallenged privilege cracked. Offices once filled with unchecked commentary and thinly disguised sarcasm now echoed with caution. People listened more, looked longer, and remembered. Laverne, meanwhile, had returned to her private office across town. She did not schedule follow-up interviews. She declined all media appearances. When her assistant asked whether she wanted to issue a public statement, she simply said, "Not yet." Because Laverne knew justice did not always need applause. Sometimes it simply needed to be done. Her team had already begun vetting other companies to redirect the investment. Within days, 2 other firms, smaller, leaner, but culturally intact, were identified as potential candidates. One of them had a diversity program, not just on paper, but in practice. Laverne marked it with a green tab and made a note in the margin, "People who see." Meanwhile, back at the original firm's headquarters, Construction began on dismantling the front lobby for renovation. The marble would stay. The plants would change. The reception staff would be replaced. But no structural update could hide the truth anymore. Because the building had already been rewritten in memory. People would walk through its doors and remember what happened when arrogance met reality. Months passed. Then seasons changed. What had once been a headline lost its urgency in the fast-turning wheels of business and media. Other scandals rose, other companies stumbled, and the public's attention inevitably drifted toward new outrages. But within the lives that had been marked by that day, the consequences lingered, not as punishment, but as reflection. Karen Whitmore found herself unable to return to the version of life she once navigated so easily. Her name had been circulated across HR databases as a cautionary tale. Every application she sent was met with polite rejection or no reply at all. She was overqualified, they said, or the timing wasn't right. In truth, no one wanted the liability. No one wanted the press. Her savings dwindled. Her phone calls went unanswered. Former colleagues no longer returned messages. The same smooth voice she once used to command front desks now stumbled through voicemail greetings. The confidence that once dripped from every clipped syllable turned brittle with silence. For a while, she avoided mirrors. Then, slowly, she sought them. And what she saw wasn't loss, it was emptiness. Not in the professional sense, but in the space where conviction should have lived. She had spent so many years training herself to speak with authority, to manage expectations, to assess value with a glance. But she had never questioned what those glances cost others. Not until her own gaze turned inward. She tried to volunteer, but at first, doors remained closed. A few organizations declined gently. One director said, "You may need time. We're still rebuilding trust in this community." That line struck harder than any headline. Still, she persisted. Because, for the first time in her life, Karen wasn't moving toward something she wanted. She was moving away from the person she had been. It was through a friend of a friend that she finally found a place willing to take her, not as a leader, not as an expert, but as a pair of hands. A small nonprofit in a neighborhood she had never visited accepted her as a program assistant, helping with after-school mentoring for minority youth. At first, they didn't know who she was. Then someone recognized her. A young volunteer had seen her photo in a think piece. There were whispers. She heard them, but no one asked her to leave. Instead, she kept showing up, week after week. She served food, cleaned chairs, organized school supplies. When a mother asked her why she was there, Karen simply said, "Because I should be." She no longer corrected people, no longer spoke first. Instead, she listened, truly listened. And what she heard changed her in places pride couldn't reach. The pain, the resilience, the generational wounds covered by ambition and necessity. She saw children misjudged by teachers, parents dismissed by banks, young professionals skipped over for promotions. And in all of them, she saw the version of Laverne that she had once pushed toward a mop closet. It haunted her. It humbled her. It healed her. 1 year later, almost the day, she was invited to speak at a community leadership summit, not as a keynote, but as a last-minute addition to a panel on corporate accountability. She almost declined. She didn't feel worthy. But her supervisor said, "People don't need you to be perfect. They need to know what changed you." So Karen stood on a small stage in a community center. No podium, just a circle of folding chairs and a group of strangers leaning forward. She held the microphone loosely, hands shaking slightly. "I lost everything," she said. "Not because someone ruined me, but because I ruined the part of myself that could have made room for someone greater. I misjudged a woman because of her skin, her posture, her silence. And in doing that, I misjudged what power truly looks like." She paused. No one interrupted. I was given a front row seat to transformation, and I almost missed it because I was too busy guarding doors I didn't build. Her voice cracked once. "Now I don't guard. I open." Afterward, a young woman approached her and said she had considered quitting her job after a similar experience. Karen didn't offer advice. She simply listened. In another part of the city, Laverne Ashford watched a recording of that moment. Someone had sent it to her without a subject line. She viewed it in silence, eyes focused but unreadable. When the clip ended, she closed the laptop, leaned back in her chair, and exhaled through her nose. Not satisfaction, not pride, something quieter. Resolution. Her firm had since grown. The investment once destined for the fallen company had been redirected to an agile tech cooperative built by diverse founders. Their partnership had tripled in value. But the win wasn't in the numbers. It was in the proof that dignity could survive sabotage, that justice could unfold without violence, that transformation, while rare, was possible. She stood and walked to the window of her office, high above the city. Below, towers shimmered with light and glass, the same as the one where she had been told to sit in a storage room. But now, those towers didn't own her story. She did. And as long as she did, there was still hope for the others trying to write their own. The end. If this story moved you, consider subscribing for more narratives that challenge injustice and reveal truth in unexpected places. What part of this story impacted you the most? Was it the quiet strength of Laverne or the transformation of those who once wronged her? Let us know your thoughts in the comments. What would you have done in her place? And tell us where you're watching from. We'd love to see how far this story travels.